Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hello/X/. My grandma passed away a few days ago. I was pretty close to her, but she was old and in declining health, so it hasn't hit me very hard. However, her passing made me think of my grandpa. I was much closer to him, and to get to the point, he believed he was cursed by a witch. He died about 6 years ago, and most of the stories I'm going to tell you were only experienced by him, my grandma, and my father. He denies pretty much everything, but I'll get to that. However, I feel I need to provide some insight and a little backstory. I won't be green texting anything. My father resented my grandpa. The stuff that surrounded him affected my father's childhood, and he blames him for a lack of equality. My father actually was really attached to my grandma, though. If it wasn't for her, my father wouldn't have let me see my grandpa. He has openly stated this to me on several occasions. The grandpa I knew was pretty cheerful. He would tell me corny jokes, buy me candy, and took me fishing for the first time. He showed a great interest in my activities at school and my friends. He would tell me lots of stories. They were about big fish he caught, or a time when he saw a tornado. However, he would tell me stories about the paranormal and the witch who cursed him. My grandma was very patient and was a stereotypical grandma. She liked to knit, bake, and would give me those sloppy kisses on my cheek. I would talk to her about my grandpa's stories, since he liked to make some stories up, like when he caught a 200-pound fish with his bare hands. She would always confirm or deny his stories when I asked her. If my grandpa had fibbed, then she would just say to act like I didn't know, because it made my grandpa happy to see me smile in amazement. However, anytime I asked about his paranormal stories or the witch, she would always nod her head and tell me my grandpa was telling the truth. Now on to the stuff you guys care about. My grandpa and grandma both lived in a small rural town in Texas. They grew up there together and fell in love at a young age. When they were both 15, they ran away in the dead of night. They both didn't like it there, and my grandma's father was abusive. Before they ran away, they promised that no matter what happened, they would support each other even if it hurt the other. That sounds cliché, but they genuinely loved each other. Anyways, they headed up north and settled down in the city. My grandpa did odd jobs to near exhaustion before enlisting in the military. He served for 4 years, saving every bit of money he could. My grandma gave birth to my father 2 years into my grandpa's service. He returned and moved to another area where my grandpa got a job doing something. He never shared what it was. Having grown up in a rural area, my grandpa was the outdoors type. He enjoyed hunting, fishing, and camping. However, being the sole provider, he had little time to do this. So one year my grandma decided to surprise my grandpa with some money she had been saving in secret, and told him to make plans to go camping. My grandma said she would stay behind and watch my father, who was 4 at the time, and he should invite a friend to spend some time with. My grandpa took his friend Herbert, who hadn't been camping in almost as long as my grandpa. The trip was planned to be for 2 weeks, so once things were set in stone, my grandpa departed. Herbert and my grandpa started hiking through some forest. I tried to ask where, but he said he wouldn't tell me and told me to never ask him again. They would stop periodically to mark some trees just so they wouldn't get lost. They did this for about 2 days before they both found a spot they deemed perfect and set up camp. Things were going great. They went fishing and had a nice catch and ate what they caught. Herbert was an expert in plants and found some edible berries that they could eat. They brought food, but I think they wanted to have the experience of living off the fat of the land. My grandpa was a hunter, and Herbert wasn't. On the 6th day, my grandpa shot a rabbit. After skinning it, it had started to grow dark, but there was still light out. Behind the tree line, both my grandpa and Herbert heard a thud-like sound. Both were curious and headed in the direction. After walking several yards, they came across a woman in rags. She was hunched over and appeared malnourished. Herbert had a bit of an uneasy feeling and suggested they turn around. My grandpa was a kind man and felt she might be in trouble. He went up to her and tapped her on the shoulder, asking if she was hurt. She looked up at him, and he jumped back. She looked old and slightly inhuman. My grandpa couldn't tell me any features that weren't right, but he felt she was a bit off from the moment he saw her. At this point, Herbert was stepping back, and my grandfather almost did the same. However, he realized an old lady shouldn't be this deep in the woods. He extended his hand down to help her up, but she apparently hissed like a cat. She then started to scream, "I smell blood! Your hands are sullied! Blood of the pure are on your hands!" Herbert at this point sprinted off toward the camp. My grandpa was starting to step back now. She then started to speak in another language that was mixed with gurgling and some very jerky movements. My grandma had to tell me the next part because it makes my grandpa uneasy. He never mentioned it while he was alive. Her face started to contort in an inhuman fashion, and all color was drained from her face. She arched back as if to let out a scream, but only foamed at the mouth. I found this out after I mentioned my mother's fear of the movie The Exorcist. My grandpa had apparently gone to see the movie, but had to leave the theater because he was crying. He said Reagan reminded him of the witch. My grandpa then decided to run back to camp. He looked back to see if she followed him, but she didn't. My grandpa wasn't the same after that. The next day, they packed up their stuff and headed home. Herbert never talked to my grandpa after that. However, things get weirder. My grandpa soon began to have night terrors. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. He never told his wife about the nightmares except one, although he did talk in his sleep. She told me she heard him say, "Please don't skin me," before waking up screaming. I can only imagine that he screamed because he was skinned in his dream. He wasn't getting much sleep, and this was taking a toll on his work as the weeks passed. He caught wind that he might get fired if he doesn't improve. That night, he decided to drink with his friend. He came home drunk and passed out on the floor in front of his room. My grandma and dad had to help carry him to his bed. That was the first night he didn't wake up screaming, although he still had nightmares. My grandpa had started to drink more and more, which wasn't a problem. My grandma didn't mind since it got him to sleep soundly, but things grew worse. One night my father was heard screaming bloody murder in his room. My grandpa woke up and screamed himself. It was from hearing his son scream and not from a nightmare. It was actually the first night he had gone without one since it started. My grandpa and grandma rushed to my father's aid, who was cowered in the corner of his room. They asked him what was wrong, but he kept saying, "Make the mean lady go away." He pointed to his bed, but no one was there. My grandpa proceeded to check all throughout the house and found nothing, while my grandma got my father to calm down in the kitchen. My father, who was still 4 at the time, told them he woke up and saw a lady at the foot of his bed. She looked scared and screamed at him that she was going to gut him alive. The next several weeks were uneventful, aside from the nightmares returning, but the alcohol was helping my grandpa stay asleep. One morning, while my grandpa and my father were outside playing, my grandma was folding clothes when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head and saw a woman standing down the hall. I feel it's worth mentioning that my grandma is probably either a great actress or isn't afraid of anything, because she just asked, "Are you the one who's tortured my husband and scaring my son?" She said the woman nodded and let out a cackle. The woman disappeared, and my grandma went back to doing what she was doing. It might have been the daytime that made her less scared, but she felt it wasn't worth mentioning to her husband. Later that night, after my father was asleep, my grandpa asked her what was funny while she was inside. She didn't understand until he mentioned he heard her laughing for a brief moment. My grandma told him what she saw and what she said. My grandpa just turned around and went to the kitchen to drink. Things continued for several years. They started to hear footsteps, whispers, and on occasion my grandpa and grandma would see the woman. My father insisted he never heard anything. Eventually, the nightmares stopped and my grandpa started to slow down on the drinking. He would still drink a little just out of fear, but not as heavily as he did. My father was about 10 when my grandpa started to have nightmares again. He resumed drinking, but how much he used to drink wasn't able to keep him asleep. He soon started to drink earlier in the day and more frequently. My father told me he would often go into the kitchen to find his dad passed out on the table. He said he hated it and started to think my grandpa was a coward. My father said he never experienced anything and my grandpa was making up excuses to drink. This is when my dad slowly started to resent my grandpa. The heavy drinking worked and my grandpa was starting to sleep again. He continued for several years until my dad was about 13. My grandpa woke up screaming for the first time in years. This woke up my grandma. She said she saw him looking around in a panic. It was in a way he had never done. This was the only dream he shared, and probably the most important. He told her he had a dream that the house caught on fire. He said in the dream he woke up to both her and my dad screaming and crying for help. My grandma had woken up to the flames and went to get my dad only for a beam to fall between the two rooms and prevent them from escaping. During this point of the explanation, they both hear the woman cackle. My grandpa then immediately told my grandma to grab the shoebox under the bed and run out of the house as he was already sprinting down the hall to my father's room. He grabbed my dad and ran out the house to meet my grandma outside. My grandma asked him why he did that, but before he could explain, she saw an orange light in the kitchen. A fire started in their kitchen and slowly engulfed the house. My grandpa started to run in and out of the house, grabbing clothes, pictures, and basically anything he could before the flames prevented him from grabbing anything else. The fire marshal said the fire started from leaving the stove on. My grandma and grandpa think it was the witch, but my dad seems convinced my grandpa started the fire himself. Needless to say, they needed a new place to live. Luckily, my grandpa and grandma saved money and were able to get a new place rather quickly. However, my grandpa felt incredibly uneasy about the place. He had the feeling the house was going to be worse than the previous one. The first week there proved he was wrong about the house. He still had the nightmares. However, things quickly became a lot worse. One day, while my grandma was cooking, she was frying some pork chops. She heard a loud crash in the other room, which caused her to jump. However, she jumped to the side toward the living room, since that's where my father was. Motherly love is how she explained it, instead of backwards. Right as she jumped, the frying pan flew off the stove and the hot grease splattered on the floor, where she would have been had she not jumped to the side. However, she did get some of the grease on her leg, and has 3 scars to show for it. Not but a few days after that, my grandpa felt uneasy one night during his drink session. He was by himself in the kitchen like he usually was when he drank. Thinking it was the woman, he readied himself for her to appear or do something. Instead, in the entryway to the kitchen, he saw a black mass that resembled a man. It stood there before fading away. This kind of activity continued for several more years. Things would get thrown, footsteps, cackling, seeing the man as well as the woman. One day, my father, who was now 16, and my grandma went to the store. They returned home to find that my grandpa was no longer there. My dad assumed he went to get more booze, but he didn't come home that night or the night after. On the 3rd day, my dad decided to ask where my grandpa was. My grandma told him that she didn't know, but he would come back eventually. Eventually, it turned out to be 8 months. This is what got my dad to completely resent my grandpa. It turns out my grandpa moved to some crummy motel and picked up a second job. He went there to slowly detox and felt he needed to stay away from the family to keep them safe. It worked for the most part. He managed to get clean, and most of the activity stopped in the house. My grandma still says she would hear things once in a while and saw the man standing in the living room one night. However, the woman seemed to follow my grandpa. At this point, my grandpa picked up a second job. He worked himself to exhaustion. He only had enough energy to make some food and go to bed. He was so tired that the nightmares didn't wake him up anymore. He also did this to pay for his hotel and to send money to my grandma and dad. One day out of the blue, he called my grandma, saying he was ready to come home. My grandma truly loved my grandpa. She was never mad and didn't question where he had been. She had complete trust in his decision. He freely confessed everything anyways. He still didn't return home after that call. He found a house while living in the apartment. It wasn't too much further than where he was now. During the phone call, he expressed he wanted to move away from that house. He felt there was something evil there, and 2 evil things made for a very bad outcome. My grandpa never returned to that old house, not even to pack. He felt he would be putting them in danger if he did. I think the witch made him sensitive to spirits and the like. He had my grandma meet him at the house he was interested in. They went on a tour of the house. It was for sale by some woman who inherited it from her mother who passed away. At the end of the tour, my grandpa asked if her mother ever complained about any ghosts. The woman looked at him and said her mom always mentioned seeing a woman that would walk around. Her mother apparently liked the extra company as she seemed friendly. The woman even said her mother lost something. I think it was her glasses or something. And she heard a voice say, "Dresser." The woman looked and found whatever it was inside her dresser. I figured this would be a deal breaker, but my grandpa said he felt very comfortable here, more comfortable than any house before. This is the house I would grow up seeing my grandpa and grandma in. They eventually moved in and my father quickly moved out. He was mad at my grandpa at that point. He stayed in the house for 2 months, and during the 2 months there were no incidents with my grandpa. The nightmares had stopped. There were no talks of footsteps or cackles. To my dad, this was a sign he was making it up all before, which prompted him to want to move out. He was 17, but my grandpa allowed it. It's worth noting that my grandma was against the idea, and in their 50-plus years of marriage, it's the only argument they ever had. However, not all of the activity stopped. My grandpa would sometimes have nightmares, and there would be a few bumps. He saw the lady a few times, but he was so used to it that he shrugged it off. This is also the house I grew up visiting my grandparents in. When I was about 5, my parents went out of town for a week. I was left in the care of my grandparents. I don't remember this, but I woke up one morning and told my grandparents about a lady that was in my room. I told them I woke up and found her standing by my door. She told me she was keeping the evil lady out of my room and told me to go back to sleep. I don't remember this, but I don't think I would know about the stories had this not happened. During my summer break of my 4th grade year, I asked if I could spend a few weeks at my grandparents'. My mother thought it was a good idea. She liked both my grandpa and grandma. My dad didn't like it, of course, but did it to please my grandma and mom. So off I went. My grandpa took me fishing the first day I was there. On the ride back, I asked him if he could take me camping since I had never been. I remember him turning white and having a scared expression. I thought he didn't hear me and saw something on the road. I asked him again, and he said no in a tight-lipped voice. I could tell it was best to not ask him why. He then turned on the radio and didn't say a word the rest of the way. One day I was waiting for my grandma to make lunch and my grandpa was sitting in the dining room with me. We were both facing this wall that had a china cabinet. To my right was a wall that led into the living room and to my left was the entrance to the kitchen. In the glass of the china cabinet, I saw a woman leave the kitchen. She was dark, not black, but she had a shadowy shade to her. I thought it was my grandma's shadow on the wall until it moved behind me and stood next to my grandpa. It wasn't more than a second after that he stood up and moved to the other side of the table. I asked him if he moved because of that woman that was next to him. He turned white again, and my grandma stopped what she was doing to look at me. She asked me what I was talking about. I said, "I saw a shadow lady come out of the kitchen and stand next to Grandpa. Did you see her too, Grandpa?" My grandma gave him a look and he just nodded his head. He then stood up and asked me if I wanted to hear a story and know why he wouldn't take him camping. That's when he told me the story. He asked if I remembered what happened when I was 5, but I didn't. He told me he thinks the women in this house are helping keep the witch away from him. I returned home a few weeks later and nothing else happened during the rest of my visit. In fact, nothing really happened on any of my other visits. I did hear some footsteps, and once I heard "It's late" when I was playing my Game Boy while pretending to be asleep. Those were a few years later, though. However, when I returned home, I asked my dad about the witch. He looked at me with a very stern expression and told me that witches aren't real, and my grandpa was pulling my leg. I told him that Grandma says it's true. He repeated that witches weren't real, and if I talk about it again, I would get in trouble. I told him I saw her, and he snapped. He grounded me for a month, saying, "Liars don't deserve to play with toys." That night, I could hear him yelling on the phone. I couldn't make out what he said, but I know he was mad at my grandpa for telling about the witch. I saw my grandparents at least once every 4 months, but after that I didn't see them for another year. Although my dad says he doesn't believe my grandpa, I think he really does and doesn't want to admit it. The night after my grandpa's funeral, he got drunk. My dad rarely drinks, and I have never seen or heard of him getting drunk besides this night. I found him on the couch, sobbing. I asked him if he was all right, and he said only this: "Why didn't I tell her to leave my dad alone?" After that, he didn't talk anymore. He just cried for a good half hour before going to bed. A few days later, I asked him about it. He told me he didn't say anything like that, and if I mentioned it again, then I would lose all my teeth. It's the one and only time my dad threatened me with violence. Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my grandpa. If I hadn't seen the reflection, I would probably believe my grandpa was a tad schizophrenic, and my grandma was just going along with it to make him feel better. My dad has been very adamant about there never being any paranormal events happening, and chalks up all their accounts as either lies, their mind playing tricks, or old house noises.
How old were your grandma and grandpa when they passed?
Grandma was 75 and grandpa was 70.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.